Live from Washington, D.C., Sekulow Live. Phone lines are open for your questions right now. And now, Chief Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Sekulow.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the broadcast. We've got a lot to talk about, and some of it, much of it, very disturbing. We're going to deal with a variety of topics today, but I want to first start with this shooting in Poway, California. A 19-year-old man who authorities said gave himself up to police shortly after carrying out a deadly shooting in a Southern California synagogue that was on the Sabbath, Saturday. So it was filled with worshipers. He's under investigation also regarding an unresolved case of arson involving a mosque. They think it's the same guy. He's reportedly a white nationalist, anti the president, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim. That's what we know right now on this, Jordan.
Yeah, it's why I think that, I see some of these like the ADL and Anti-Defamation League try to tie this actually to the president and to politics in America. And let's just be honest about it. These people that commit these attacks are neither left nor right. To call them right-wing extremists, I think, is to do a disservice to just a basic political spectrum. These are individuals who dislike the president because of anti-Semitism and his support for Israel. They dislike Muslims because of they don't believe Muslims can be good Americans. It's like the list goes on and on and on about it. They're not even on a normal political spectrum. They are white supremacists. I think that's the fair thing to call them, similar to neo-Nazis. And there is a rise of it around the world. We're now seeing more of it here. It used to be the rise was happening in Western Europe, Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. Now we're seeing it here. This attack on Saturday was 6 months to the day of that even more deadly attack
Tree of Life
in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where 11 worshipers were killed, 6 other wounded. That was the deadliest attack against Jews ever on U.S. soil. So this was, again, also came with Easter weekend. Let's not forget the attacks in Sri Lanka by Islamic extremists. So extremism, certainly a problem, and it's targeting people of faith directly, and how we have to kind of move forward. But I think that one of the problems is what has been acceptable political discourse. You've got an example in your hand
this as one right
that has
here.
been allowed to be published in an international New York Times, which goes to the entire world.
Yeah, so the next time the New York Times talks about that, the president or others are using rhetoric that encourages anti-Semitism, here is a picture of a cartoon of a blind President Trump.
The yarmulke.
Wearing a yarmulke, wearing glasses indicating that he has lost his vision, with a dog whose face is Benjamin Netanyahu with the Star of David around the dog's neck. And that basically Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is leading the blind, and the blind is the President of the United States. References to Jews as dogs, and I take this very personally, is outrageous because that's one of the oldest forms of anti-Semitism. And in Europe, the New York Times in Europe did this, and their response is, it was the work of a single editor who was working without adequate oversight and downloaded the syndicated cartoon and made the decision to include it. By the way, on all the pages it went on, the opinion page of the New York Times International
No explanation.
version.
It didn't even have
no
text
explanation,
with it.
no text with it. A picture of a blind president of the United States, Donald Trump, being led by a dog whose face was Benjamin Netanyahu's. Outrageous? You bet. These papers have the nerve to say it's the president or it's Republicans or it's conservatives in doing this. Put that up on the screen again for everybody to see it. You got to point to the evidence on that. The face of Benjamin Netanyahu leading a blind Donald Trump. And Benjamin Netanyahu's face is on the body of a dog with a Star of David. Folks, we're taking a break. When we come back from that break, we'll be taking more of your calls and comments. It's a very serious issue, the rise of anti-Semitism. And the New York Times running this political cartoon is outrageous, coming on the heels of the shooting at the synagogue. This is just horrific. We've got a petition up because we think these congressmen that are promoting this anti-Semitism need to be censured. Sign that petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen, aclj.org. It's the easiest way for you to do it. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now. Online at aclj.org.
So we had the horrible synagogue shooting in Southern California at a Chabad synagogue, and 1 dead, many wounded. We have a New York Times cartoon. I want to put this up on the screen again. It's horrible, but I'm doing it because you need to see the evidence, folks. That is a cartoon of Donald Trump, President of the United States, wearing glasses indicating that he's blind, being led around by a leash of a dog, and the face of the dog is Benjamin Netanyahu, and the dog is wearing a Jewish star. You put Jews and dogs together, it's anti-Semitism that's been utilized by anti-Semites forever. And the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and around the world is at an unbelievable pitch right now. I mean, unbelievable. The amount of anti-Semitism. In fact, I've thought about, we've talked about internally, a lot of it's arriving out of England. We've thought about setting up a center against anti-Semitism right out of Westminster. I mean, I think it's literally that bad. And while the Jewish groups are trying to combat it, I think all of us, and I put myself in the Jewish groups, but since as a Jewish believer in Jesus, I will also say that the Christian community needs to engage this issue. This is very serious. And by the way, the same shooter in the synagogue was also, at least as a suspect, in an arson action against Muslims that were just worshiping at their mosque. Again, not fitting in with ideologies here. But it's a level of hate. Nikki on Facebook said, when will Congress stand up and condemn this discrimination? Really, when are the American people going to stand up? Vice President Pence said, we stand with Israel and we condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, including at New York Times political cartoons. What was your read of that cartoon, Harry?
Well, my read of the cartoon is that it is clear beyond question that the left, which routinely criticizes the right for all forms of discrimination, is prepared to engage in invidious examples of discrimination when it suits their political purposes. So I think the cartoon itself was particularly vile and particularly vicious. It coincides with a shooting at a California synagogue.
Right, what we talked about.
And so it's very, very important to put all of this in context. Meanwhile, Senator Ted Cruz and Meghan McCain, who've criticized Representative Ilhan Omar for her anti-Semitism, they are getting slammed. It's time to slam the New York Times. Yep. It's time to slam this particular cartoonist who has a history of issuing cartoons with anti-Semitic tropes.
Well, here's the thing. This is, CC, get your reaction on this. This is the statement from the New York Times. We are deeply sorry for the publication of an anti-Semitic political cartoon last Thursday in the print edition of the New York Times that circulates outside the United States. So first of all, they admit, number one, it was an anti-Semitic cartoon. Of all the places it was circulated, it was in the print edition outside the United States, like the last place. No, it shouldn't be anywhere. And we're committed to making sure nothing like this happens again. Such imagery is always dangerous, and at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise worldwide, it's all the more unacceptable. They've investigated how this has happened and learned that because of a faulty process, that's what they're blaming it on, a single editor working without adequate oversight downloaded the image. What do you think?
Well, the New York Times didn't just start yesterday. So a faulty process. I mean, they have processes in place, and that's a cop-out is what it is. And I agree with Harry. I mean, the New York Times is always claiming that conservatives are the hateful and intolerant people.
We're the ones stoking this.
Absolutely. And here they have a cartoon like this, which is hateful and intolerant.
And Congressman Dan Crenshaw, who has not been afraid to call out Ilhan Omar and others, he wrote that, quote, even if unintentional, the left And America has normalized anti-Semitism under the guise of criticizing U.S.-Israel foreign policy. It's exactly what this cartoon, which went a step further in its anti-Semitism with the depiction of Netanyahu as a dog, with putting a yarmulke on a blinded President Trump. But again, it is trying to normalize anti-Semitism under the guise of criticizing U.S. and Israel foreign policy. In the New York Times, they apologized for this. Just 2 days later, there's an attack on a synagogue in the United States where a woman is killed. 3 are injured, including the rabbi there, lost a finger in the incident as one of the members dived on top of him. I think that was the person who was killed. And again, that could have been the gun jammed, so it could have been much worse. It was a 19-year-old. I think what the congressman said is absolutely right. When you start normalizing anti-Semitism under criticizing U.S. foreign policy, this becomes not just criticizing U.S. and Israel foreign policy. This is the exact merger we've talked about of.
Yep.
This cartoon, I think, speaks volumes to when we say that the anti-Israel statements are just a way to be anti-Semitic without saying you don't like Jews right up front. Basically, and this is the depiction of it in cartoon form, if you want to call it that. I think though that it's right to play what, though I don't agree with everything the ADL has said about this, what Jonathan Greenblatt said. Let's put this up while we play what Jonathan Greenblatt said on CNN by 30.
Stop dignifying it as a cartoon. It, like you said, it is propaganda. It wouldn't surprise me if this was published out of Tehran or Damascus, but it doesn't belong in the New York Times or any credible media outlet.
Let me tell you something. We have fought on this aggressively. We've been at the United Nations where we've been fighting BDS, or the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, which is another form of anti-Semitism. I've spoken before the UN a couple of times, once at the General Assembly. And we have litigated. We are litigating the case right now, by the way. We've got a case in litigation right now in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia that we're litigating on this issue of this kind of anti-Semitism, where these Palestinian groups bringing these charges. And the Palestinians leadership may be laughing about this. When you put a picture of a Jewish person face on a dog with a Jewish star, that would have been bad enough, by the way. And then, of course, you make it worse by having him leading, the so-called blind president. But this is it's anti-Semitism at its highest form. And the New York Times put it out there with this weak apology, blaming, as Cece said, a staff member who wasn't supervised. And, this paper, as you said, Cece, has been around a long time.
Right.
Like 150 years, maybe more. You'd think they'd have a process to not let an editor pick a picture, a so-called political cartoon, to go on their opinion page of all pages. That's the opinion of the paper throughout Europe. If there's no good place to put anti-Semitism, that's number one. There's no place where this would be acceptable. But having it in the European edition only makes it worse. It would have been horrific here. It's even more horrific there. And the New York Times' weak condemnation is ridiculous, repulsive. So the next time they blame conservatives for stoking the fuel or the anti-Semitism, physician, heal thyself is what they need to be reminded of. They had processes in place. Now, I'm not going to say that this was an intentional move by everybody at the New York Times, but it was an intentional move by somebody who had somebody that had enough authority, CC, to take a picture, a cartoon, syndicated cartoon, political cartoon, and stick it on the opinion page of the New York Times. That has to be a pretty senior person.
That's right. And it's not a mistake.
Of course not.
It was done intentionally. So, they're sorry afterwards, but they should have been sorry before. They had a process in place. They should have censored this beforehand. It should have never made it to the newspaper.
Let's go ahead and take a phone call.
Yeah, let's go to Amy in New Jersey on line 1. Amy, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live.
Hi, Amy.
Hi. I don't know how to say this, but, I'm a frustrated Jew because I don't see Jews waking up. They're going to still blame this on conservatism, right-wing ideology. You still hear them saying that Hitler was right-wing. There's a lack of education until the Jews start realizing that it's the left-wing people that are the hateful ones that are pushing this, and they keep voting for the Democrats that aren't calling this stuff out. The rabbis in the synagogue are not saying anything. I don't support the ADL. I believe the ADL is dangerous because they're not waking up Jewish people. You have Jews that don't want, they think they're afraid of the Second Amendment. They don't want to arm themselves in a synagogue to protect themselves. I just think there's a lack of education.
Well, look,
out
here's
there.
what I think it is. I don't want to blame. I'm not going to blame. I don't cast blame like friends of mine on the left tend to do. But when you've got people like Ilhan Omar and others that are making these statements, you can't. I'm not going to blame the entire Democratic Party for their statements. I don't think that's right either. But you can blame the individual. Like you can blame
blame Nancy Pelosi for not coming down. She's as responsible for what Ilhan Omar says as Ilhan Omar is, because she is the leader. She can take her off the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Elliot Engel is just as responsible. He is basically, by not taking action to remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee, is uttering her words. So shame on all of them. It's not every Democrat, but certainly the leaders who have the power to take her down a notch and make her a freshman member with no influence. Instead, they keep letting her get away with statements, which is exactly what we're talking about here, is that this is anti-Semitism cloaked in anti-Zionism.
Folks, we're taking a break. When we come back from that break, we'll be taking more of your calls and comments. It's a very serious issue, the rise of anti-Semitism. And the New York Times running this political cartoon is outrageous, coming on the heels of the shooting at the synagogue. I mean, this is just horrific. We've got a petition up because we think these congressmen that are promoting this anti-Semitism need to be censured. Sign that petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen, aclj.org. It's the easiest way for you to do it. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now. Online at aclj.org.
I just asked Harry about I said to him that there was no excuse for this, and Professor Hutchinson had a very powerful statement on this, and I think you need to hear it. So, Harry, there is no excuse for this. This is, I mean, even what the New York Times says in the excuse is ridiculous. But you said that drawing this distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is a very thin line.
Absolutely. So we live in a world in which the left often wraps its rhetoric in the rhetoric of anti-Zionism. In reality, of course, the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism operates as a distinction without a difference. Essentially, anti-Zionism has been transmuted into one thing and one thing only, and that is intolerance and bigotry, which is unacceptable on either the left or the right. And so it's very, very important to call out all of the purveyors, including the New York Times, of this form of bigotry.
So, CeCe, you ran for Congress a number of years ago, and you've got these congressmen and women that are making statements, like Jordan said, that the leadership is not really holding them accountable to. They'll make a general denial statement on anti-Semitism, but you got Representative Tlaib, Representative Omar making anti-Semitic statements, and they kind of get away with it.
Right. If there's no punishment for bad actions, then they will continue. And that's where Jordan is absolutely correct. If you don't have leadership telling them that this is unacceptable and it's not right, especially from a congressman, then they're going to keep doing it. You're not going to have any accountability. And then they get away with it. It's just like a child who's not, being disciplined. If they get away with it, they keep doing it. And we're seeing that they're getting away with it, and these kind of statements keep happening. We know the UN goes after, Israel and Jewish people. So do universities in the United States. And now we see the New York Times doing it, and it keeps growing.
All right, so I'm going to play for you. I normally don't, but I will. Brian Stetler from CNN. I think his show is Reliable Sources. This is what he had to say about the New York Times, a paper he worked at.
The New York Times is a great newspaper. I used to work there, but this is inexcusable. This was something that was straight out of Nazi propaganda. And the idea that any editor there, even some obscure editor in some far-flung office, would see this and think it was appropriate is shocking. And I'm glad there's been this level of concern and condemnation all the way from the president on down around the world, because the Times needs to be held accountable on this.
And then here's the president that Brian Stelter's commenting on President Trump, condemning what happened in the synagogue shooting as well. And I think Vice President Pence has condemned the specific imagery. Here's President Trump.
America's heart is with the victims of the horrific synagogue shooting in Poway. Our entire nation mourns the loss of life, prays for the wounded, and stands in solidarity with the Jewish community.
And this is on the same weekend where the liberal media is still trying to go after President Trump on Charlottesville and Robert E. Lee, and even the distinction he made between Robert E. Lee being a good general military mind versus who he was as a person, and they were going after Kellyanne Conway this weekend on it. And it is the liberal media's shining star, the New York Times, which has this international edition, which, as you said, is even worse because that is where the anti-Semitism is growing at an even more rapid speed, that has its editor choose to include this.
Editor for the opinion page. I mean, they can't blame this on low-level editor. This editor had the authority to take
the New York Times. What's a low-level editor?
Put it in. Yeah, what is a low-level editor at the New York Times?
No, there isn't one. I mean, there's the international editors may not get as much attention here in the U.S., but I bet if you actually look at circulation, the international New York Times is much bigger than, kind of like how CNN International
is bigger than CNN. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and take another call.
Yeah, William in Georgia online too. William, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live.
Hey, William.
Hey, Jay. Hey, Jordan. God bless you guys. Here's my question I got. This might be a question for you. Would there be any consequential political ramification for those who actually promote these anti-Semitic acts and these pictures that they're doing on there, as well as the ones that are supporting this?
That's a good question. I mean, what are the political ramifications of this? I mean, Cece you were kind of addressing that if the leadership doesn't take action on its members, it's hard to say there's any real political consequence. Right. Now, what it may give pause to is members that are leaning Democratic on these particular issues or on these statements that Ilhan Omar and Tlaib are making. Maybe it causes them to pause. But are there any real consequences without?
I would
if there's no consequence to their bad acts,
right?
What happens?
I would say then ballot box. Then it goes to the hands of the people,
right.
And the people need to rise up and vote whether they approve of these anti-Semitic statements or whether they don't. They need to use their vote to get these people out. If the leadership is not going to condemn and have these people, take accountability for their actions, then it needs to be at the ballot box.
So, Harry, I've thought about this. Is the reason they're not doing what Cece said, which is to, condemn it, say, with actions, not just words, because they're afraid of the left flank of that party?
Absolutely. So I think the Democratic Party in particular has become dominated and controlled by the left-wingers in their midst. And I think, for instance, the House leadership, including Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, they are literally afraid of the reaction from the left. And so in some respects, the left-wingers in the Democratic Party have hijacked the entire party, and so the Democratic Party message increasingly features intolerant attacks on Jews for political purposes. And Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer appear powerless in the face of these Twitter attacks, many of which are incoherent, they're nasty, and they feature many forms of intolerance and bigotry.
I want to play Rabbi Yisrael Goldstein's statement to the press just yesterday.
You're listening to a rabbi that today could have been my funeral. What happened on Saturday morning, the unthinkable, the unfathomable, where I faced death face to face. This is not supposed to happen. This isn't Nazi Germany. This isn't a program. This is right here, Poway. This is our home. This building that we built is supposed to be full of love. This building that we built was supposed to be able to share kindness and love with each other. What is happening?
What is happening is there's a rise of anti-Semitism globally, and we don't allow a political accountability or even legal accountability on some of these issues. And there is a left wing of a political party right now that is pitching this anti-Semitism motive, anti-Semitism approach, and the leadership of this political party is afraid to take it on.
Yeah,
that's what this is.
And instead, try to push it onto
that's what it is.
Put it onto blame the conservative president for it when they've got a radical Muslim congresswoman calling out Jews as much as she can, and sitting on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Eliot Engel and Nancy Pelosi try to say, well, she's one of the three, but they do nothing to condemn her. They couldn't get the condemnation through their own party. It's why Joe Biden's going to have a tough time getting the nomination because, again, this is the party of even where this was under Barack Obama is a different party. He may have taken it more to the left, but it has now gotten extreme. It's gotten college liberal extreme, professor, like that level, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-American.
That's going to do it for the broadcast today. We've got a petition up. We think the congressmen and women that are spewing this anti-Semitism, that's one direct action we can take here, need to be censured. And they could do that in Congress. Not just said, oh, that's inappropriate. There needs to be some action. We encourage that to take place. Sign the petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen right now. We encourage you to do that. Also, pray for our team. We're fighting this in court. We're fighting this at the UN. We're fighting this through our offices in Jerusalem. Your support makes a huge difference to the ACLJ. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with you next week.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now, online at aclj.org.